The animal self is a evocative term. It has a long history in civilization. Greeks thought their animal self was the base part of themselves. It was the part of themselves that was just controlled by passions and appetites and violence and just everything that seemed problematic to the human being was they kind of encapsulated within the animal self. And I think a really good example of this comes in their statuary. So if you go to the museum and you see statues of heroic figures here, and they're beautiful. They're all muscly and well proportioned. And do you notice anything about the statue, though? And sort of, it seems to on one hand embody all of these great human virtues. But if you've seen a lot of these statues, there's something peculiar about them.
His penis is like,
yes, his penis is tiny. Go and look at all these statues. They have tiny, really, really undersized penises. And I don't think it's because the Greeks had really undersized penises. Now, Michelangelo's David, same thing, tiny little penis, big heroic guy. All right, so the question is why? Why did they sculpt these with really tiny little penises? And I think there are two answers for it. So one of which came from an artist friend of mine. He said, if they actually made proportional penises or even large penises, that's all you would look at. It would just dominate your visual thinking. Okay, so from an artistic standpoint, maybe you want to de-emphasize this as a focal point of attention. But more importantly, the Greeks wanted to emphasize and celebrate rationality. They wanted to de-animalize their heroic human figures. And this was not the site of a Greek prudery. If you go and look at Greek myths, they're filled with stories of debauchery, rape, murder, all these sort of things, or even Greek sculpture. This is a satyr, and if you see little statues of satyrs, you normally don't see them in the family-friendly sections of the Met, but they're all carved with these enormous phallic erections, they're really this grotesque carnality there. And they're meant to see as this is the animal self. It's basically all of these base desires coming forward. And they basically said, for civilization, what we needed to do is to celebrate the humanity and the human part in absence of our animal selves. And this basically continued in our civilization for thousands of years going forward. And we are still told, and I'm going to talk more about this in the weeks to come, but that the animal self is problematic. And it's problematic around the questions that we normally think about in terms of our life force. It's problematic around food. So, our appetites are wanting to just eat and pleasure ourselves with eating. It's problematic with respect to sex, as our satyr friend here shows. Sex pulls us out of ourselves. It causes instability. It takes us out of our rational mind. And it's problematic with respect to death in terms of our anxieties and fears that keep us from thriving. And so a big part of our animal self is about the life force, and it is about how food, sex, and death gets realized in an animal being. And that's all the times when we think about the animal sex, we just stop there. We think, okay, that's the animal self. It's all about these problematic desires. And I'm going to talk more about optimizing ourselves relative to food, sex, and death at our animal level later on. But I want to focus on something else today that's also part of the animal self that's not this kind of grotesquerie. And it's an idea that the animal self is doing something more. That the animal self is really there, is trying to make a map and predictions about reality around us. What your animal self is doing is basically taking this collection of trillions of cells, getting them to work together, and getting them to operate as one in this environment that you're trying to navigate. Now, to understand the animal self, we're going to have to basically go back to biology, and if we're going to understand anything in biology, we need to focus on evolution. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about evolution because we all have a kind of an intuitive sense of evolution. We've all been taught a bit, taught it, and a lot of people still in the United States reject it. Like half of Americans still don't believe in evolution, by the way. We live in a pretty mystical country. But when we think about evolution, we oftentimes think about something like this, like a New Yorker cartoon. You see the little thing in the water and it's coming out and it's evolving in stages and it's becoming greater and greater and greater with each successive stage as sort of the evolutionary tree. And it started with these sort of single cell organisms at the bottom of the tree, and then you went up to sort of advanced organisms and advanced organisms and advanced organisms. And of course, at the top of the tree typically was us. At the time they would say man. And I think this informs us. It's an idea of progress, of single unitary organisms progressing over time, getting better in each incarnation, and then culminating in this glorious species that's at the top of the food chain, that's empowered of all, and that's us. And you know, I was looking for images of like evolution, and I was typing images of evolution, and you oftentimes see things like this, you know, like particularly late human evolution going from chimpanzees up to us. And almost, here's the amazing thing, they almost inevitably culminate in like a white European dude. It's like, oh, these white European guys are like, I am the culmination of evolution. I will put myself there. Like, kind of fascinating. In fact, evolution, if you ask a biology, looks something, the tree of life looks something more like this. It's an incredibly wide branching tree. The most dominant forms of life on the planet tend to be microbes. If you were an alien and you came to Earth and you wanted to sort of say, okay, how would you describe life on Earth? They would say it's microbial. Microbes are still the most dominant form of life on the planet. They outweigh all other forms of life in terms of their biomass. They will be here long after we're gone. If we annihilate ourselves through some ways, like say nuclear war or you know some other global catastrophe, microbes will still be around. This is the primary way that life keeps going. We are just accidents here. And the person who really brought this to light was, of course, this guy, Charles Darwin. Now, it's interesting to think about Darwin here because when I was young, I really liked transgressive thinkers. I was like, ooh, Michel Foucault, Nietzsche, they're so cool, they're transgressive, they're upending my way of thinking about the world. The most transgressive thinker in human history has been this guy. Because with his theory of evolution, which by the way, he was so terrified of when he first came up with it, he kept it hidden away for 15 years. Because he knew the blowback was going to be so intense, and it was. And basically, what evolution does is knock us off our perch of our own preeminence. It basically says we are just a random outcome. We are an accident. If you went back and rewound the tape of of life and Earth, you know, say a couple 100 million years ago, and then you know let it play out again, it's likely we wouldn't exist. There's so many accidents, so many random mutations that led to us. We are not a foregone conclusion. We do not have a destiny. This basically destroyed almost every origin story that had existed in mythic culture. Because it said we're just the outcome of inevitable chance here. Or another way of sort of saying this, and this is even further destabilizing for us, is our only purpose here is not in our own individuality, it's just to perpetuate the life force. Or as Samuel Butler said, you know, a chicken is simply an egg's way of making another egg. Or from a genetic standpoint, as Richard Dawkins would say, we are just meat puppets for our genes. We are just ways for our genes to replicate themselves. And the genes are mindless. It's just this mindless chemical algorithm. So, wow, that's a really hard thing to think about. I mean, when I think about myself, I think about, oh, all of my precious thoughts, my dreams, my identities, what's so important to me, and they're all ephemera, really, to my DNA, and more specifically to the genes within them. But it doesn't just stop there. If you actually look into your biology, it gets even more complicated. Take mitochondria. Everybody know what mitochondria are? Remember that from high school biology? The powerhouse of the cell, yes. It's what transfers all our energy. That seems great. Anybody know anything else about mitochondria that's kind of curious? It has its own DNA. Think about that for a second. Within each of your cells is a creature that has a DNA that's completely different from the DNA that codes for you. Now, Lynn Margolis, who was a biologist who was from here, had a great theory about this, which was a theory that took a long time to get accepted, but probably is now kind of accepted, which is that somewhere way back, a couple of billion years ago, as the planet started oxygenating, there was sort of a larger eukaryote cell, and it ingested a smaller mitochondrial cell. And instead of destroying it, the two developed a symbiotic relationship. The larger cell would protect the mitochondria from the atmosphere. The mitochondria would help the host cell get more energy. But what this means is really profound. You and I are not simply composed of two different species. We are composed of two different domains of life. You are an amalgamation. Within each of your cells is actually two different species. You're not a singular species. You're two species coexisting together. The amalgamation doesn't stop there. Think about your microbiome. Within your body and on your body are trillions and trillions of bacteria, fungi, protozoa. They all have their own DNA. Now, you could say they're not part of you, but they actually make up probably around 5% of your body weight, or up to 5% of your body weight. But more importantly, they are part of you because you couldn't live very well without them. They help you digest, process vitamins, fight off diseases. We have this amazing symbiotic relationship with all of these other creatures. We are not a singular person. We're much, much more of a walking menagerie. This is our animal self. Our animal self is this menagerie of creatures coming together. And it's generating this sensation and this experience of a sort of unitary, solitary being. But it's really a bunch, just countless, countless creatures coming together to do this. So this then begs the question, if each of us really is something of a we, because it would really, ironically, we should be calling ourselves always in the plural. We should always be using them, they pronouns. If you think about your molecular and biological structure, you're them, they. And so why am I more of a me than a we? And what I want to talk about this is 4 key elements of the animal self, and I want to talk about them using their musical analogs. Because I think the best way to actually know your animal self is not this seething cauldron of passion and desires, not all these problematic impulses that you might have. It's actually something far more sublime. It is this experience of trillions of beings coming together to generate this experience of you. And I want to do this in the same way that like a musical group or an orchestra comes together to do this. This is really what's happening with you. You are like a symphony being played. So let's think about 4 elements of music and how they relate to the self. So the first one. Were any of you in like middle school orchestra or band? Like, is that familiar? What's wrong with that piece? It's awful. Yeah, it was just, and why is it awful? Because the instruments are out of tune, they're out of sync. The first thing that makes a great piece of music is coherence. Is having all the constituent parts play together in time, in tune, and in harmony. Same thing happens with yourself. If there's any part of yourself that's not coordinating with the other parts, if your arm is like uncontrollably twitching, or you get a cancer cell, or you get some kind of disease, the whole organism's not going to function well. And so how does coherence emerge? And to do this, let's go back and go back about 650 million years ago to the emergence of multicellular life. And this is really where the animal self begins. It begins when a bunch of individual cells started coming together and finding ways of working together. And the first multicellular animal was probably something that was like a little flat disc, maybe something the equivalent of a sponge that we know today. And it was basically all of these organisms coming together and figuring out, we can exist in harmony. And they were, drawing in nutrients from the environment and living that way. Now, the important thing is what is it that differentiates an animal from a plant? What's the primary thing that differentiates an animal from? Plants are consuming and getting their food and energy from sunlight. So this is why plants are structured in the way that they are. A plant does not have a fixed body plan. It basically grows to wherever the sunlight is, and it doesn't have to move around. We animals get our energy by ingesting other living things. And so for our first multicellular sponge ancestors, they basically did this by just sort of existing in place and letting nutrients come to them, and they started eating them together. Now there's a real problem though with this strategy, which is that if you're a sessile animal, like a sponge, you're basically at the mercy of your environment. If the food stops coming to you, you're done. So at some point in time, they started moving around, and probably the earliest mobile creature was something that was equivalent to a jellyfish today. And it's kind of a lovely thing to think about. So one of your greatest grand ancestors on your animal side was a jellyfish. Moving, though, poses its own problems. Because if you're moving about, you're going to be a lot more efficient if you know where you're going to, and you can sense your environment, and you can react properly to it. You know, a moving animal doesn't want to run away from food. It doesn't want to eat a mate, unless, of course, she's already copulated. That was a joke. But it's true. And so you needed to have, if you're an animal, some way of negotiating with reality. And a good example of this is one of my favorite sea animals. It's a tunicate, also known as a sea sprite. And sea sprites are pretty amazing. The first half of their lives, they float around and they move around getting nutrients. And then once they basically are ready to reproduce, they fix themselves to the seabed or to a rock or something. They become sessile. And what they do also at that point is they consume their own neurons, because neurons are very expensive cells and they don't need them anymore. They become couch potatoes. They basically eat their own brains. And I think there's an interesting sort of analogy here. It's like the more, less mobile we are, the more inert we are, the less we think, the less vibrant we are, at least in that regard. And so the key here for knowing about coherence, and this is going to come up throughout the lecture, is this thing. It's a neuron. It's the primary way that cells in a multicellular creature can connect direct information to one another. The first neurons were basically there probably to coordinate movement in the jellyfish. Basically say, okay, muscle 1, you contract, muscle 2, you contract, to do this undulating movement. But then neurons also began to sense things in the environment, to be able to sense light patterns, to sense chemical triggers, and sensation evolved. The other important thing that was really providing coherence for this multicellular animal were hormones. We're going to talk more about hormones a lot later on in the class, but hormones are like general purpose chemical signals. So like if a neuron is conveying a very specific message from one part of your body to another, or hormones like a general call out there. It's just like speaking out to a large room as opposed to say whispering to a particular person. But this actually has a big, profound impact for us, and it's often sometimes easy to forget. This feeling of self that we experience, this coherent, unified feeling of me, is the consequence of these neurons and these hormones, but primarily these neurons firing electrical signals. And what this basically means is, and it goes back to this idea of we as processes. We are beings of energy, not just in our cellular structure, but everything that is manifest to our consciousness is just an energy expression. It's just the electromagnetic waves pulsing through our neurons. And this, it's a really kind of profound notion here. This experience is not solid, it's not stable, it's not even that singular. It's a culmination of all of this electrical activity coming together at one time. That is what makes us. During COVID, I started learning how to play the piano. I'd never really played piano before, and we were locked at home. So I started playing, and I was learning, and I was playing songs not even this well. I was just kind of playing these kind of little melodic tunes. And my wife Thea was like, "Can you stop playing so many sad songs? We're in COVID. It's really getting me down." I'm like, "I'm not trying to play sad songs. I'm just playing simple songs, and I'm playing them slowly. And oftentimes you can play the happiest song, and if you play it slowly, it's going to sound like a sad song." And this is the kind of funny thing. In music, as in life, tempo means a lot. And this is a second kind of fundamental principle of your animal self. It's being ordered in time. And this goes back to the next kind of animal in our lineage. As basically animals began to evolve, flatworms began to evolve out of jellyfish, and flatworms could do something really nifty. They could bury into seabeds to keep themselves protected. And that was a great trick. There was a big problem with that though, because once you become enclosed as an animal system, you've got to figure out a way to get oxygen and nutrients into your interior cells. And nature's answer was a circulatory system. So everything that we know is part of our own circulatory system, our hearts, our lungs, blood flow, the organs, thorax, all this traces back to this great grandworm. This did a number of important things for us. First of which is, once you get a heartbeat, once you get a breath, it situates you in time in a very distinct way. Think about it, if you're not aware of your breath, if you're not aware of your heartbeat, it's easy to get lost in time. It's easy to kind of lose yourself in that particular way. The second thing that happened with worms is that they started giving us hormones. And hormones basically began situating us in a circadian rhythm. If you wonder why you're sleepy at night or you're hungry at certain parts of the day, these are hormones that are fluctuating through you. And in a lot of ways, what hormones do and a circadian rhythm does is situate you relative to the turning of the planet and the rotation of the planet around the sun. It situates you celestially. And that's a pretty groovy idea. The last thing that happened with worms, and I think in some ways is the most important, is what worms also evolved: memory. The funny thing about a worm is, like, if you take a flatworm and you can train a flatworm to be tolerant of light. Worms typically don't like light very much, but you can literally train a worm. You give it little worm treats. I don't know what these are, but you can give a little worm a treat and make it like happy to be around light. And then if you're a particularly curious or sadistic lab experimenter, you can then cut off the head of the worm. And then worms are pretty interesting in that they grow their head back. And not only will they grow their head back, they'll retain the memory of being light tolerant. Memory is ancient. It goes so far back in our animal lineage. You can even say it goes all the way back to the beginning of life. DNA, in one way, is kind of a form of memory. Evolution really is a memory process. It's about a response to that. But we hold tons of memories. Our bodies store memories. All of our scars, all of our physical conditioning. I look this way because I did a certain amount of exercise and ate a certain amount of food. And if I had eaten different foods, I wouldn't. This is a common thing. The body keeps the score. The body does keep the score. Your body is a repository of memory. But of course, the greatest storehouse of your memories is in your brain. And the interesting thing and the important thing about memories is that you're constantly making them. And I'm going to talk more about memories in a couple of weeks ahead. And they're really, really important for the self. But memories situate us in time. Because everything that we've done up until this point is affecting everything that we're going to do in the future. And every moment you're making a memory. And this is akin to an Eastern notion of karma. Every action that we take right now is indelibly marking ourselves and marking our self processes in such a way that it's going to change our future outcome. We're going to delve much, much more deeply into this in the weeks ahead, but I just want to mark it here. And the remarkable thing about memory is how it traces back to your ancient worm grandparents. So thank you, ancient worm grandparent, for all these wonderful things. So, all right, what makes that song such a, like any pop song, what makes that song so great?
It's catchy.
Yeah, but what makes it catchy? What makes a song catchy?
Repetition.
Repetition, and what's so important about repetition?
Predictable.
Yes, it's predictable. And great songs are just predictable enough. There's a sort of zone of predictability that makes a really popular song. If it's too predictable, it's dull. And if it's too unpredictable, it's jazz. Basically, pop songs are at that great level of we kind of know what the chord progressions are going to be, and this is a big important fact of your animal self. It wants predictability, and this traces back to an event that happened around 550 million years ago called the Cambrian explosion, when your animal life, for whatever reason, began to just take on this amazing diversity of forms. And most importantly for us, it's when vertebrates emerged. And what was happening with vertebrates? Well, they suddenly started developing all of these new kind of sense organs. They had eyes, better smell, better taste, better sensation. They started greatly elaborating their entire nervous structure. they started centralizing their nervous structure into, you know, a singular kind of coordination point, and this of course became the basis of the brain. And so it began to take in all of this all this information from its environment. Now, if you begin to expand all of your sense organs, if you begin to, and this is an important thing to think about, as you begin to take in more information from the world around you, what do you need to do? You need to have a better psychology. You've got to have a way to cope with all that information coming in. And so basically in the Cambrian, we begin to see the beginnings of sort of a brainstem and a brain. And the basic function of a brain is to coordinate all of this information that's coming in to help this. And why is it trying to coordinate this information? The brain is basically doing two things. First off, the brain is making a map of reality. It's trying to get a sense of what is going on in the environment and inside the organism itself. What is happening in this world, in order for then it to make predictions about what to do next. We're going to use this phrase a lot. The brain is basically a prediction machine. And what this basically means is that we live under the regime of certainty. Our brains are constantly making predictions and looking for certainties. One of life's greatest pleasures is a certainty. It's solving something that's a puzzle. That's why puzzles are stimulating. That's why learning things are stimulated. That's why conspiracy theories are compelling. These give us certainties. And we are hard and deeply wired to try to find certainties. Why? Because they help us create maps of the world and give us predictions about how these things could go forward. And the problem that we'll see, and one of the big challenges of our animal self, is not simply the food, sex, and death. It's the kind of predictions that we make. It's the kind of certainty that we need, and how this oftentimes leads us astray. This is called a monkey chant. It's from Bali. It's basically reenacting out the Ramayana, and the story of sort of a monkey fight in the Ramayana. You notice anything about these guys? They have smiles on their faces. One of the best things you can do in life is to make music with other people, to sing together, sing and play music and make music together. This is one of the most ancient human things that we do. It's a way of connecting with each other. They do this in this really profound, syncopated way, and it's really amazing. But you know, choral music, bands, concerts, what are we doing? We're binding together. And this brings us to the other most important thing about the animal self is interdependence. No self is truly an island. You know, all selves basically interact and engage with other selves, but we humans in particular are super interdependent. And this expresses itself in so many different ways in our psychology, and we'll be talking about this. But one of the most interesting ones when it comes to mammals, and particularly primates like us, is empathy and mirror neurons. And if you think about what empathy is, basically empathy is when I take someone else's, what I imagine their internal emotional state, and I represent it within myself. So not only am I making a map of reality, I'm making a map of you, and I'm replicating it inside of me. And we are hardwired for empathy. We are, I mean, think about like, oh, how cute. That's an empathy trap. It basically is, a cute animal is an empathy trap. It basically evokes this feeling of empathy from us. The other thing is mirror neurons. Like any other primate species, we learn a lot by physically copying one another. And what a mirror neuron is, it's basically the same neurons. Like if I'm using neurons to move my arm like this, and you're looking at it, within your head right now, the same neurons that are firing in my head that make my arm go like this are firing in your head copying this. That's what a mirror neuron is. It's monkey see, monkey do. This is especially profound in hominids like us. If you look at our own animal history as a hominid species, it's about socialization. It's about growing. And you can see this in what's known as the encephalization quotient. The size of our brains. We humans have outsized brains. Our brains are so much more disproportionately large to our body mass than any other creature. And why is this? And Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist, has a good explanation for this. It's basically because we're more social and we're more socially interdependent. And I'm kind of running out of time, but Dunbar has a number that says he thinks that like naturally there's about 150 people that we're naturally meant to keep track of at any given time. With our technologies now, we've been able to greatly expand this number. And living together, though, of course, with our species did something else. We started doing two important things. We started using fire and making fire, and we started using tools. That's going to lead us into what my lecture I'm going to lecture about next week. But I want to go back to this question here to end up here in terms of what is my purpose. So when I'm in Escalante and I'm looking at the nighttime sky and I'm wondering why am I here or what is my purpose, it may seem like that's a very human and kind of profound thing, but really what it is that's my animal self that's asking that question. It's my animal self that's thinking about me as an individual, kind of, me as alone, creating a solitary illusion of a solitary singular being here. It's my animal self situating me in time in terms of the vast timelessness of the cosmos. It's my animal self desperately trying to find certainty in sort of all of the cacophony of nature. And it's my animal self that is panging for the loneliness that oftentimes gets evoked kind of when looking at the cosmos. So this then begs the question for us, how do we, if we go back to our purpose is to sort of maximize our functions or best know and align our functions, what is the function of the animal self? We're going to be talking a lot about this because the animal self now is going to start coming into conflict with other layers of ourselves. But when you start thinking about your animal self, I want you to think about yourself as a piece of music. Think of yourself as an emergent phenomenon. Think of yourself as this glorious output of trillions of cells coming together. Think of yourself as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This is you. This is your vitality. This is why this music is so amazing, because it really expresses the vitality of this animal self that's coming from within us.